Another Elden Ring top 5 build video. It has in fact been a while because honestly I've made like every single type of like build video category under the sun, but one thing I have yet to do is just the definitive top 5 best, just the regular top 5 best ones. So we're gonna make that video today, but as always there's gonna be some variety on this list. So I did cover one build for every single stat: strength, dexterity, faith, intelligence, and arcane. If you want to see a particular set of builds, I have a whole dedicated playlist, you can just go check that out. Anyway, let's just get started. Okay, so the first build I want to go over is the dexterity based build. Now for this build, we're going to be power stancing a couple of spears, and the stats for this is basically just go all into dexterity. You want to have about 15 faith for certain types of incantations, as we will get into, and you definitely want a decent amount of endurance. I have 25 here because power stancing spears does consume a lot of stamina, and being that you're using multiple weapons, you probably want a little bit more equipment load as well. Now for the weapons of choice, we have the cross naginata and the spiked spear. Now both of these obviously spears that both do bleed type build up. Now the cross naginata, in my opinion, is going to be the better option in terms of having a spear, because it gets the better light attack combo with its horizontal swipes. It gets more range and actually gets better scalings. But the reason why we're not using two of them is because you can only get one per playthrough. So if you actually are a new game plus, you're just better off just going with a second cross naginata. But the spike spear is still going to do a fine job, and it actually is a pretty decent weapon as well, because it actually does do strike damage, which is very unique because no other spear actually does do strike damage. But when you're power stancing, you're only going to really benefit off that piercing damage, which is perfectly fine because piercing damage is arguably just the best damage type in the entire game. A lot of enemies are just very weak to it. And specifically with power stancing spears, it's amazing because you get very quick movesets that can actually go pretty far, and they hit at the exact same time. So your DPS and its damage in total is just going to be very high. Now both of these obviously do scale with dexterity. We have a dexterity based build, so we're going to have both of these be keen infused. Now the cross naginata, we're going to have this one on infused with impaling thrust. Now impaling thrust is a very good complement to spears themselves, because spears don't really tend to get good poise damage or actually good staggering potential, but impaling thrust is an Ashwar that actually can do that. And for only 9 FP, you can stagger larger enemies and do 30 stance damage in just one hit. It is actually very beneficial. Now, as for the spiked spear, we're going to have this one infused with Thunderbolt. Now, Thunderbolt is a lightning-based Ashwar of which scales with dexterity, but the reason we're going to go with this one is because we're lacking a projectile option with this build, so having Thunderbolt is actually a nice projectile. It doesn't stagger very well, nor do much poise damage, but it can do some just decent total overall damage and some nice DPS, and it doesn't really cost that much either. So if you're in a situation where like you have to hit something at a distance, or you're trying to kite enemies out or hit them one at a time, just using this is just going to be a very solid pick. Now you'll also notice that I do have the Misericord in my back pocket, and that's for two reasons. One, because we have it infused with the Golden Vow, and Golden Vow is just going to be an Ashwar, which is going to give me more damage and more defenses. And it is an aura buff, so it's just going to stack with all the other buffs that we actually will be using as well. And the Misericord is actually going to be the highest critical damage weapon in the entire game at 140 crit. You can just get a whole bunch of just riposte and backstab damage. So if you ever do end up getting the poise break on an enemy, you actually can just switch to the Misericord and just get the riposte. It will rarely happen because you're using spears, so the main purpose of having the Misericord is just for Golden Vow. But if you ever do get into that circumstance, switching to it would actually benefit you greatly. Now we also have the Dragon Communion Seal. It just has very low requirements, it doesn't weigh anything, it's just nice to have, just to cast some basic types of incantations. Now, as for the armor, the only one you got to worry about is the White Mask. This one would actually just boost your damage by 10% if you just proc bleed on a nearby enemy. As for our talismans, we do have the Lord of Blood Exaltation, which basically works the exact same way as the White Mask, but instead of 10% more damage, it will give you 20% more damage for 20 seconds. Now, against enemies that cannot be bled out or bosses that cannot be bled out, I recommend switching to the Spear Talisman instead, because that will just enhance your counterattack poking damage. But as for the other talismans, you definitely want to have Shard of Alexander, which will enhance your weapon skill damage by 15%. Millicent Prosthesis will just boost your damage on successive hits, and being that you're power stancing with spears that hit at the exact same time, the buff can stack very quickly and you can just get a bunch more damage. It also does give you +5 to dexterity as well. We also have the Ritual Sword Talisman, which boosts your damage by 10% at maximum health. If you do struggle staying at maximum health, I would just recommend going with a talisman that just boosts your neutral game, whether it be stamina regeneration, more equipment load, or just more defenses. And in your Wondrous Flask, I recommend just going with the Dexterity tier and the Thorny Crack tier, which works very similar to the Millicent Prosthesis. It's just more damage on successive hits, but you do get this one later in the playthrough, so until you actually do acquire the Thorny Crack tier, just going for something that boosts your neutral game is just going to be really nice, like stamina regen or just health regen. Now, as for our spells, we are going to have Blood Flame Blade, which is going to be a buff, which just adds more bleed and a little bit more fire damage to our weapon. Now, unfortunately, this can only be equipped onto our right hand, and double unfortunately, when you switch off it, it's going to remove the buff. So if you want to switch off to get the Mystery Chord Riposte, it's going to lose the buff. If you want to switch to your Spike Spear to use Thunderbolt, you're also going to lose the buff. But just having more Bloodlust put up is obviously going to be a lot more beneficial. And in terms of our other spells, you definitely want to have Flame Grant Me Strength, which is going to be 20% more physical and fiery damage for the next 30 seconds. And having something like Bestial Vitality for more health regen, or just having other types of damage negation spells is going to be really beneficial because you have 15 faith and you can use them, so you might as well. Okay, so next up, we're going to be covering the strength-based build, of which we're going to be using the Colossal Sword, known as the Great Sword. Now, this weapon is actually probably the best strength weapon in the entire game, probably right behind the Star Fist, which I probably consider a little bit better, has more of an upside, but it's a bit harder to use due to its range. But I have a build that I've already made somewhat recently around the Star Fist, so you can check that one out if you want to. But as for this build, we're just going to go all into strength basically. Have 14 dexterity because that's a minimum requirement. Have a bunch of endurance because obviously we're using a larger type of weapon and you want to have some type of defenses alongside with that. And we're going to have 20 faith for some types of incantations we are going to be using. But the Great Sword is just going to be the best Colossal Sword in the game because it has amazing range, you get amazing damage, you get really good strength scaling, and Colossal Sword movesets are just pretty decent themselves. You get some nice variety, and this poking attacks that you get with the crouch and the roll is actually really beneficial. But obviously we're going to have this heavy infused alongside the Giant Hunt Ash of War. Now Giant Hunt is probably my personal favorite one to pair alongside with the Great Sword because it's a very quick animation, only consumes 16 FP, and you can just yeet enemies into the air and do a whole bunch of stance damage, total of 36 stance damage. Now the Lion's Claw Ash of War is also very good, probably easier to use because you just get infinite hyper armor throughout the entire animation, but the reason why I prefer Giant's Hunt more is because you get a quicker animation, you can do more damage, and it consumes less FP. Now you will also notice that I do have a dagger infused with Chilling Mist put into my back pocket. Now the reason for that is just to proc Frost on enemies before I actually start the fight, because Frostbite can actually be procced very quickly with Chilling Mist, and it will just make them take 20% more damage for 20 seconds, and that will just be all sources of damage, just be improved. Now I do also have the Clawmark Seal as well, because the Clawmark Seal gets a very decent strength scaling, and you can just go all into strength, and actually still get some decent spell damage out of this as well. As for the armor, you can do whatever you want, but as for the talismans though, definitely have the Ritual Sword Talisman, which is going to just boost your damage by 10% at maximum health. Now once again, if you struggle at staying at maximum health, just do something to boost your neutral game, whether it be health regen, stamina regen, or just more defenses. Definitely want to have Shard of Alexander as well, which is going to boost your skill damage by 15%. Now you also want to have the Great Jar's Arsenal, which is going to boost your equipment load by a bunch, and the Erd Tree Favorite +2, which is going to boost your equipment load, health, and your stamina. Now as for your Wondrous Flasks, you want to have your Strength tier equipped onto it, and I went with the Stone Barb Crack tier as well, which is just going to boost your poise breaking potential. But unfortunately, this tier does only last 30 seconds. So if you want something that can last a little bit longer throughout the entirety of the boss fight, you could probably go with something like Health Regen or the Stamina Regen one. But as for the spells, you can go a bunch of different ways. You can go check out my top 10 best spells list if you want to know more about it. Having Catch Flame is really good because it's very quick. It's short range, doesn't consume much FP, and does actually some decent DPS. Having Lightning Spear is nice because it's a very quick projectile option that doesn't do too bad of damage. You can also have Electrify Armament, which is just going to be a weapon buff that just boosts your damage with more lightning, but it won't really boost it by much. It'll probably give it like plus 100 lightning damage, but it still does more than what Greases actually give you, so you might as well use it. And you are going to want to use Golden Vow and Flame Grant Me Strength. Now Golden Vow does have a 25 faith requirement, and you notice that I only have 20 faith, but before you actually start the boss fight, you can actually switch to the 2-finger heirloom, and you'll gain +5 to faith. Use the Golden Vow, and then you can just switch off the talisman to another one. And being that you are putting a little bit of points into faith, you might as well use some of the health regen spells or some of the damage negation spells as well. Okay, next we have the intelligence build, of which we are using the Darkmoon Greatsword. Now, unfortunately, the Darkmoon Greatsword is like acquired realistically towards the second half of the game. So if you want something a little bit earlier on to use for an intelligence-based option, definitely recommend the Wing of Astel or the Death's Poker. Both of them are just S tier weapons, just amazing. I do have builds for these. I can just link them down below. But as soon as you do acquire the Darkmoon Greatsword, I recommend putting that one on because it's probably just the best weapon in the entire game because you just get free projectile heavy attacks that deal 33 stance damage, do a whole bunch of frost build up, and the regular damage itself is just out of this world. Now the stats for this build is basically just go all into intelligence because that's what it scales off. You don't even need too much mind with this build, being that your projectile attacks don't really consume any FP. But if you did want to actually use more spells with this type of build, then I would recommend putting a bit more points into mind. But the Darkmoon Greatsword, just a regular greatsword, but its weapon skill just buffs the weapon with more frost damage and more magic damage, and it turns your heavy attacks into projectiles. Now in our back pocket, we are just going to have a regular dagger, just infuse that with Golden Vow because that's just going to be an aura buff, and it'll just end up adding more damage and defenses for 45 seconds. And in our offhand, we are going to have the Jellyfish Shield. Now this is a great shield, of which actually does get 100% physical block damage reduction. But the reason we're going to be using this is because that its weapon skill, Contagious Fury, actually does boost your damage by 20% for 20 seconds. Now, unfortunately, once you actually do remove the shield, it actually will lose the buff. And you actually can't use weapon skills alongside with this because when you click L2, it will just do the shield buff. But the good thing is about the Darkmoon Greatsword is that its weapon skill is just going to be a buff, of which will just last 60 seconds. So we just use the Darkmoon Greatsword buff, use the buff of the shield, and then you basically can just spam your heavy attacks, which is the projectiles are going to come from. You just end up getting 20% more damage that way. Now our staff of choice to cast some spells is going to be the Carrion Regal Scepter because it is actually going to be the best sorcery to actually have once you get past 60 intelligence. Now, unfortunately, the requirements is actually going to be 60 intelligence. So earlier on, I recommend just going with the Meteorite Staff, which is a very solid early game option. And just probably use that until you actually do get the Carrion Regal Scepter. Now, as for your armor set, I just went for defenses and I do have the Helmet of the Queen's Crescent Crown to just boost my intelligence stat by +3. Now, you can actually also go with the Spellblade set, which actually will boost your damage of the heavy attacks that the Darkmoon Greatsword gets by 2% every single piece. You actually can get 8% more damage if you just have the entire set on. But unfortunately, when you have this, you're not going to have much defenses, nor are you going to have much poise. But if you're good at dodging, you might as well just equip it because 8% more damage is going to be really good. Now, as for your talismans, you can go a bunch of different ways. I have the Ritual Sword Talisman equipped, which is going to boost your damage by 10% at maximum health. I do have the Magic Scorpion Charm as well, which boosts your damage by 15%, or your magic damage by 15%, but actually does make you take a bit more damage as well. Now, I do also have the Godfrey's Icon and the Shard of Alexander, because both of these will actually boost the damage of the projectile heavy attack that the Darkmoon Greatsword does get. So no, the Spiked Crack tier nor the Axe Talisman will actually benefit off the heavy attacks. It's just going to be benefited off these types of talismans right here, which the Godfrey's Icon will just boost the damage by 10%, and then the Shard of Alexander will just give you a flat 15% damage buff. Now, as for the Wanderer's Flask, you definitely want to have the Intelligence tier and the Magic-based tier as well to just get a bunch more damage. And as for your spells, honestly, you don't really need to use any spells at all because your projectile that you get with a Darkmoon Greatsword is just going to be good enough. But if you did want to know some good spells, I have a top 10 best sorceries video. You can check that one out. But basically, just want to have stuff for variety, covering different types of ranges. I have Carrion Slicer. Magic Glint Blade is good for enemies that like to input read. Magma Shot is a good fire option against enemies that are weaker to fire, obviously. Rock Sling is a very solid physical type damage spell. And I do have Rani's Darkmoon, which that spell doesn't really do any great damage, but it does do a bunch of frost build up and actually does debuff enemies to make them take a bunch more magic damage. And you definitely want to have Terra Magica as well because that summons a magic pool of which when you're standing inside it, you just do 35% more magic damage, which is just absolutely ridiculous. And Commodore Zero is going to be a spell you want to have because against a bunch of different bosses that don't really move around much, it's just going to just destroy them and melt them straight away. Now, if you actually are deciding to use certain types of spells, I recommend changing your talismans around. So if you're not going to decide to use your weapon much in a certain type of boss fight because you want to use Commodore Zero, I recommend just changing up the Shard of Alexander and the Godfrey's Icon to the Graven talismans that just boost your spell damage. Now, specifically when using Commodore Zero, you want to have the Azur's Glintstone Crown equipped because that will just boost the damage by 15%, but actually will also increase the FP cost. But if you're going to be pairing this alongside the Cerulean Hidden tier at the start of a boss fight, that will just completely remove all types of FP cost that you actually do get, and it will last about 15 seconds, so you're going to spam the Commodore Zero, you won't lose any FP, and you'll probably just end up melting the boss before they even reach you. So basically how the build works is that you want to spam your heavy attacks, and once you get to a boss that doesn't really move much, just switch to your Commodore Zero build and just end up melting bosses that way. Now, as for the Faith build, we're going to be building around the Blasphemous Blade. Surprise, surprise, probably like a top 2 best weapon in this entire game, because it gets really good scalings, its weapon skill goes incredibly far, goes through enemies, does a bunch of damage, has really good health regen, you get health regen upon kills, does some decent poise damage as well. It's just amazing. But the stats for this build, even though the Blasphemous Blade does get a C scaling in both strength and dexterity, it actually scales a lot better off strength. So we're going to go into 30 strength and just put the rest of your points into faith because that is where all the damage is going to be coming from. Now in our back pocket, we're going to have the Black Knife. Now the reason we have the Black Knife is because when using this weapon skill, it just debuffs enemies to make them just take flat 10% damage and they'll end up taking percentile damage over time. Now this is scales of faith, so you might as well just use it. You can just use this throughout the entirety of the boss fight and you'll be perfectly fine. Especially if you're going to go up against an enemy that is actually weaker to holy damage, being that actually does do holy damage, it's probably going to be the better option. But as for our seal of choice, we are going to have the Godslayer seal, because this one's just going to be the best faith-based seal between 27 and 69 nice faith. But as for your talismans though, you definitely want to have the Shard of Alexander to boost your weapon skill damage by 15%. The Ritual Sword Talisman, which will boost your damage at maximum health by 10%, which this actually pairs nicely with the Blasphemous Blade because obviously you're getting a bunch of health regen, so you're probably going to stay at full health more times than not. Having the Carrion Filigree Crest is definitely going to be really good because you're going to be spamming your weapon skills, whether it be with the Blasphemous Blade or the Black Knife over and over again. And it will just decrease your FP costs for the Blasphemous Blade from 30 to 23, which is obviously really nice. And we're going to have the Fire Scorpion Charm, which does boost our fire damage by an additional 15%, but it actually will make us take a bit more damage as well. Now, if you do feel like you're taking too much damage, I'd probably switch this one off and put on the Flox Canvas Talisman instead to just boost your spell damage. But speaking of which, in terms of your spells, you can go a bunch of different ways. If you want to know what the best spells are, I have a top 10 best incantations video. You can check that one out. But what we want in terms of making a build is just variety in terms of damage types. We already have fire, we already have holy. So basically all we have left is just lightning damage. So we have lightning spear, which is going to be our main projectile option. It's very quick, does decent damage. You can fully charge it. Now in terms of having a physical based spell, I like to have the crucible haunts. It's good at closing distance. It does some nice damage, good poise damage as well. Now as for your buffs, obviously golden vow, flame grant me strength. That is going to be a must-have. Now, Hellish Iburi is actually going to be a better option in terms of a body buff over Flame Growing Strength in terms of damage. But the reason I'm still not going to have that one is because it makes you take a bunch more damage. And the extra bit of damage you get with Hellish Iburi is just not worth it over Flame Growing Strength. If you're going with a build that didn't really utilize physical or fire damage, then Hellish Iburi might be the best option. But being that we're already doing fire and physical damage, you might as well just stick with Flame Growing Strength. But another spell you do want to have on is the Ancient Dragon's Lightning Strike. This is probably just the best spell in the entire game. It does a bunch of damage, which it's going to be good against all bosses, but it's specifically good against larger bosses. So if you do go up against one, I definitely recommend building around it. So I'll just switch off the Shard of Alexander and the Carrion Filigid crest for the Godfrey's icon and the Phlox Canvas Talisman. I'd also take off the Fire Scorpion Charm for the Lightning Scorpion Charm and take off the Flame Shrouding Cracked Tier for the Lightning Shrouded Cracked Tier. And one thing you can also do is actually put on the Gravel Stone Seal on your main hand, which will actually just further boost the lightning spell damage by 15%. You don't even need to use it. As long as you just have it equipped, you can just use the Godslayer Seal and you'll still benefit off that 15% more damage. If you didn't want to use the Gravelstone Seal, if you don't have it, you could just use the Jellyfish Shield and just use the buff for that and it will just work perfectly fine as well. But in this instance, you probably do want to have the Hellish Iburi equipped because obviously you're doing lightning damage. Flame Growing Strength is not going to be doing anything for you. So with all of these buffs equipped, you're just going to be doing a bunch of damage. And as you can see on screen right now, Ancient Dragon's Lightning Strike is just melting everything. Now, in terms of the rest of your spells, you can just use a bunch of different types of healing-based spells, whether it be like a health regen one or one that just gives you a flat amount of health. And also, you might as well utilize the damage negation spells as well because you're basically just tanking like 60% more damage, which is just absolutely ridiculous. So you might as well take advantage of them. Okay, now last build we have is the Arcane based build, of which we are using the Mogwin's Sacred Spear. Now this one is just probably the best Arcane weapon in the entire game because it does a lot of damage. It is a great spear, which is going to have a nice moveset, does some decent poise damage. You get the poking attacks, which piercing damage is just amazing. You can pair this alongside a shield if you wanted to, although I don't really have one for this build because you actually can block and poke at the exact same time with spears. But its weapon skill is just ridiculous. It does a bunch of Bloodlust build up. It's a nice AoE, you can hit multiple enemies at once. And even outside of the Bloodlust build up, the damage is ridiculous. It stun locks them. It's really good. But as for the stats though, we're just going to go into 24 strength, which is the minimum requirement for the Mogwin's Sacred Spear, and just put the rest of the points into Arcane because it scales a lot better with that, and its weapon skill also just directly scales off Arcane. Now, every single time that you do have an Arcane build, I recommend just going into Faith, because the Dragon Communion Seal is just the sole reason why Faith Arcane builds are just the best build type in the entire game, because it's just amazing. You get a ridiculous incant scaling and dragon spells are just broken. But as for the armor, the White Mask is the only thing of relevance here because this one is just going to boost your damage by 10% every single time that you do proc bleed on an enemy that actually is nearby. Now, as for the talismans, we're going to have the Ritual Sword Talisman once again, 10% more damage at maximum health. Want to have the Shard of Alexander for 15% more skill damage, the Lord of Blood Exaltation, which will also just boost your damage every single time that you proc bleed. Now, if you're going up against an enemy that cannot be bled out, I recommend switching to the Phlox Canvas Talisman to just boost your spell damage. And the last talisman slot is going to be for the Royal Medallion, which is going to boost the damage of our Dragon Breath incantations by 10%. As for your Wondrous Flask, you're going to want to have the Faith tier, which the reason we have the Faith tier is because there's no Arcane tier, and using the Faith tier is just going to, one, just give us more Faith, which means a little bit more spell damage, and actually is going to help us meet the minimum requirements for some of the spells that we are going to be using, like Grail's Roar and Golden Vow. And for the other tier slot, you can just leave on the Fire-based tier because the Mogwin's Sacred Spear actually does do a little bit of fire damage, but I'll have this be more dependent on what type of enemy you are fighting and what type of Dragon Communion spell you actually do want to go with. For instance, if you go up against an enemy that's more weak to magic type damage, you probably want to use the magic type breath spells and probably just leave on the magic tier. But as for the spells though, we're going to have Catch Flame, which is going to be a very solid melee based spell. It's very quick, you get solid DPS, and it is very cheap. And it does complement the Mogwin's Sacred Spear very nicely because that actually has a slower moveset. Going to have Golden Vow and Flame Growing Strength for just more damage and more defenses. We're going to have Grail's Roar, which is a spell that doesn't really do too much damage, but it actually does debuff enemies to make them do less damage and actually take more damage. So using that at the start of the boss fight is going to be really nice. Dragon Maw is a very solid physical based dragon spell that actually does do a bunch of damage and some nice poise break. And the rest of your spells are basically just going to be your dragon breath spells, but definitely want to have the lesser versions because the lesser versions is going to result in more total overall damage and probably going to have the quicker animation because the named versions, they cost 25% more FP, but they only do 17% more damage. So in terms of like FP efficiency, going with the lesser versions is going to be the better play. Unless you're talking about Magma Breath versus Theodorix's Magma, this one, for whatever reason, it just does a bunch more damage, so you're better off just going with Theodorix's Magma, which that spell is just absolutely ridiculous. As you can see against Radagon, it just does a lot of damage. But Rotten Breath is going to be another solid pick. It does physical damage. They did like nerf it a while back in terms of the Rot build-up, so it's no longer as good. But if you're going up against an enemy that is more resistant to elemental damage and you want to do physical damage at a distance, this does it very well. But my personal favorite dragon spell will end up being Dragon Ice because Frost build-up is just absolutely ridiculous. They just end up taking 20% more damage. And Glintstone Breath is just going to be the highest damaging spell for whatever reason. It just does more damage than the fire-based one and all the other ones. Don't really know why, but yeah, the magic one just does more damage. But basically the entire build is just spam the Mogwin Sacred Spear weapon skill. Unless you go up against an enemy that's like resist to bleed, or they don't really get staggered that easily, so you're pretty better off using projectile options, of which I would just switch to the Dragon Communion spells and just melt enemies that way. And even if you don't really like using the Dragon Communion spells, you could just use some other incantations, whether it be Lightning Spear or Ancient Dragon's Lightning Strike. You could just use those and still do decent damage because the Dragon Communion seal is just that good. But being that the seal just does boost your dragon incantations by an additional 15% and they already do ridiculous damage, you might as well use them. Anyway, that pretty much concludes it for that one. As always, please do like and subscribe because I do have some more Elden Ring videos coming along the way. And do follow me on Twitch. I actually am live there every single day doing some like random no-hit runs or challenge runs, whatever it may be. Definitely check me out there. Anyway, see you guys in the next one. Bye.